Hey, LA Progressive friends and family. Today I'm going to be having one of our regular conversations, and we thought it would be a good topic to make into a video that we post on the LA Progressive. Sometime during this past week, a few days ago, I was in a meeting with a bunch of other journalists, and congressional representative Ayanna Pressley was speaking to us about her announcement of a piece of legislation to end qualified immunity. And she was very eloquent on the topic. Qualified immunity, for those of you who don't know what that is, it is a court-invented doctrine that has shielded law enforcement officers from accountability for misconduct and denied victims of police brutality of having any recourse. And so Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley talked to a bunch of journalists. All of us are representing either Black-owned media or are Black journalists. And so she was talking to us from the perspective of the amount of Black people who have been so disproportionately harmed by misconduct and police brutality, and yet so few of us really understand qualified immunity.
Right. So one case, an example is yesterday in Mississippi, Indianola, Mississippi, an 11-year-old boy, Darian Murray, called the police, called 911 because his mom was having trouble with her boyfriend. The police came, the boy came out of his bedroom, and the police officer shot him in the chest. Thankfully, the boy apparently surviving, which is pretty remarkable. He was shot at short range with a pistol. But right away, there is talk, well, the police officer will be shielded from civil suits by this concept of qualified immunity. So could you tell us how that works?
So qualified immunity, how does it work? So basically what qualified immunity does, it provides a shield against not just police officers, but any state actor, anyone who works for the state, the city, the federal government. It's the right, first, a right that is clearly established has to be violated. So a victim must identify an earlier decision by the Supreme Court or a federal appeals court that says that the right that they are saying that this, let's say we're talking about police officers, the right that the victim is saying that the police officers violated was a clearly established right. And until they can prove that it was a clearly established right, then qualified immunity is applied to the police officers. So, I mean, it's a somewhat difficult doctrine to explain. In legalese, it is, and I'm going to read what I have in a PowerPoint presentation when I was doing a presentation about qualified immunity. It's when a public official is performing a discretionary function, so something that is associated with their job, when they're in the line of doing their line of business. So they're performing their job, they enjoy qualified immunity or a type of protection in a civil action for damages, provided that their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person would have known. So in layperson speak, what this means is that a public official, in this case, we're talking about police officers, under certain circumstances cannot be sued for something that he did while in the line of duty. In other words, qualified immunity almost always provides cover or protection or insurance that protects law enforcement officers from lawsuits and any action taken while they're performing their job.
So one of the defenses of that is that, well, if police officers and if any government official didn't have this protection, then they'd be sued into bankruptcy. So what's your defense on that?
Well, I mean, that's a complaint that's brought up, but according to the Institute for Justice, That's actually not a sound complaint, because first of all, this doctrine of qualified immunity just recently became something in American legal parlance. There was no such thing as qualified immunity before the 1980s. It was discussed, and there's something similar came about as a result after the civil rights movement. But qualified immunity came about as a result of a Supreme Court case in 1982, and police were not having problems with being excessively sued.
But isn't it also case that it's kind of a bogus thing, because the police officer himself or herself would not actually pay anything. The taxpayers would, through the government. They would pay if there was any penalties, unless the officer or other actor clearly violated the law. Is that not true?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by it's a bogus thing. So currently, and let's make this very clear, qualified immunity only applies to civil cases, so
Right.
not to criminal cases. So if they clearly violated the law, we wouldn't be talking about qualified immunity. But qualified immunity is when a harm has been done to a victim and a police or the city or the state actors claim that they're immune from the lawsuit that's being brought against them because the police officer was acting within the boundaries of his job, and he had a reasonable right to behave the way that he did. It has been demonstrated that less than 1% of the time when there is a lawsuit, and let's say that the victim prevails, less than 1% of the time does the police officer ever get impacted in terms of his own personal pocket.
Well,
it's always the taxpayer.
Well, that's what I meant by it being bad. That actually, it's a bogus criticism, because police officers almost never end up paying anything, or other government officials. They personally almost never pay.
But it's not bogus. I mean, it's still legitimate. Qualified immunity is.
It's a bogus complaint to say, to run behind the defense that, oh, if we don't have qualified immunity, police officers and others left and right will be sued into bankruptcy.
Yes, that's
all I meant by it.
Yes.
And then another complaint about it is well, if you don't have qualified immunity, courts are gonna be swamped with frivolous cases. Everybody in the world will sue a police officer for everything that comes down the pike. Is that not true?
No, that's not true. Like I just said a little while ago, that qualified immunity basically didn't exist before the 1980s. There wasn't no slew of frivolous law cases.
Right, but the little bit of research I did is the defense against that argument is that courts already have ways to toss out frivolous cases early on, and it would be just a waste of time to be suing officers or government officials on that basis.
That's right. So it was encouraging to me that Ayanna Pressley has put forward this legislation. Let me see if I can find it. It's called the Ending Qualified Immunity Act. It's authored by Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts and Senator Edward Markey, also of Massachusetts. And here's a quote that Ayanna Pressley put out, and this is on her website. She says, police brutality is a crisis plaguing Black and Brown communities, and a crisis that will continue to go unchecked until we end the dangerous, unjust, and court-invented doctrine of qualified immunity. For too long, qualified immunity has prevented accountability and shielded those charged with enforcing the law from any consequences for breaking it. And she really brings up an important point. I was recently reading about one of the killings. Sometimes it's overwhelming. There were so many of them, but one of the officers involved in the Tamir Rice shooting, he actually was the shooter. He had been fired from a police department shortly before, like 6 months before he got the job, in Ohio, where he killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was doing nothing more than playing outside by himself with a toy gun. And within 2 seconds of the police arriving on the scene, Tamir Rice was dead. But this business of not being held accountable, they are not being held accountable for even the wrongdoings that they've done on previous jobs. They rarely go back and look at the history of these officers. So there are many reasons why qualified immunity is really causing harm to our communities. And I would encourage anybody that's listening to this to look up the Ending Qualified Immunity Act, authored by Representative Ayanna Pressley and Senator Edward Markey. Anything else you want to ask about this, hon?
No, I think I learned a little bit. I think this is important. I think another reason for getting away from qualified immunity is it dissuades litigation. I mean, when people hear about qualified immunity and it gets no place in suing an officer or a government official, well, they give up beforehand. And with qualified immunity gone, then if they have a just cause for suing, they would go forward most likely.
Right. I mean, not to mention the damages, obviously when we're talking about loss of life, there's no amount of money that can replace the loss of life. But in many cases, the people who pass away are parents, they have children,
Right.
Children who need to be educated and cared for and so on. So damages are a remedy that are available to a prevailing plaintiff in a civil action. But if those damages are made unavailable because of qualified immunity, then you have the secondary victims,
Right.
the children of those, of the
Right.
father who was killed and so on. So I'm hoping that this was an informative discussion, and we're going to be doing some more of these in the future.
Right.
Maybe we can find a lighter topic, because I got to tell you, just reading about this, there were times when I just want to just go upstairs and get in the fetal position and put my head under the covers.
Yeah, and the other thing, so if qualified immunity went away, maybe officers would be more careful about their violence. Now, apparently the officer in Mississippi just made a horrible mistake. But Jesus, did he have to have his gun drawn already? And he saw a movement and he shot it. It's just horrible. I mean, and lately it seems like there's been one shooting like this after another.
It doesn't just seem like that. Studies have demonstrated that the increased violence by police officers against unarmed people has gone up,
Right.
even after George Floyd. So yeah, this is definitely something that we need to continue to talk about and continue to take action, like ending qualified immunity. So thank you for joining us, LA Progressive Friends and Family. And this is Dick and Sharon signing off, and we'll talk to you again soon.
And next time we'll have a topic that'll have one laugh in it.
Yeah, like Brazilian butt lifts.
Yeah, that was one of our early ones.
Yeah. So long, everybody.
Bye-bye.